Hey guys, it's SharpZ. After being involved in some weird Silent Hill stuff and finally escaping the month of October after the entirety of the month of November, I've kind of decided it's no more monsters, blood, or mayhem for me. I think I'm done with that for a while. Ugh. Do you care to explain why you're in my interrogation room then? You do realize murder is a serious offense, right? So, logic and deduction games. One of my favorite genres. One that's centered around the use of facts and logic to progress. Now, I know what some of you are probably thinking. What is deduction? No, I just wanted your alibi. Deduction, simply put, is a comparison of two facts, or two truths, to come to a conclusion. The most common example that is given is Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. Dead old Greek guys aside, deduction games use this concept as the core driving point for progression. In order for a game to qualify as a deduction game, it must have gameplay which centers around the use of information given within the aforementioned logical context to progress. These games generally fall into three categories. Category number 1. Alright, let's start with our first category, linear deduction. Linear deduction, simply put, is, any form of deduction that follows to one logical through line. So, for example, all the logic, regardless in the order it's portrayed, will end with one conclusion. Think of case-by-case games like Ace Attorney or Danganronpa. While there are usually multiple questions in one case, and usually these questions are presented out of order or kind of go from place to place, at the end of the day, you're trying to answer one question. Who done it? And the answer is always the same, following a preset route or series of actions. While not every game with a linear case is linear, every linear game will follow one line of logic to its conclusion. For example, games that have one case but are more complicated fall into our second category, and that is nonlinear deduction. These games either have multiple lines of logic which interweave and, lead to multiple conclusions that are part of one broader overall conclusion, or rather than the goal being to reach one ending conclusion, it's to reach a broader set of conclusions. For example, Obra Dinn has multiple ways to find out who specific people are, and in some cases, different conclusions on how they died can still be correct. For example, with the captain's wife early in the game, and this is slight spoilers, however, this is something that you will encounter within the first 30 minutes, and it's fairly easy to see, but there are two options for how she is killed. You can say that she is clubbed by the beast, or that the mast falls on her. Even though both of these are somewhat correct, it kind of points to the overall thing with nonlinear deduction. Rather than the goal being to find out who this woman is, your goal is to find out a lot about most people on the ship. There are a whole lot of smaller linear deductions in this game, but they all interweave and have interplay with each other, so it's not really linear. Two others that come to mind are Paradise Killer and Her Story. Her Story, for example, follows a very, very unique premise of using a video search engine by searching for words that appear in various video files. Through this game doesn't have a lot of structure compared to its linear counterparts. However, you can kind of jump from place to place, and if you play your cards right, might even be able to find a logical conclusion within a few hours. Paradise Killer I also listed here because, even though the information that you get is kind of linear, the way in which you present it and the actual court case itself isn't really a linear presentation as much as it is I have all the information that I have gathered, not all of it's necessary, and the conclusions aren't always the same. It's more so based on what the logic leads to. The final category, I would argue, is social deduction. While the two other categories mostly rely on writing, Social deduction relies on the human element. Actions, words, and ideally interaction between players or player-like entities is key to these games. Think of a game like Town of Salem. Different roles, and you need to figure out who everyone is based on only a chat box? Yeah, that is social deduction by its definition. A few more prominent examples that come to mind are Deceit, Among Us, Grow Up. It's currently year. Like, seriously, this game has been popular for a long time, and even though there's a stigma around it, it is part of this genre, so I have to at least mention it. An interesting one I also want to point out is Gnosia. I hope I pronounced that right. A game which adapts social deduction, a usually multiplayer affair, into a single-player environment through randomization. And honestly, it kind of works mainly because with things like visual novels, which this game is, it's kind of key to grow bonds with the characters, so by engaging in the gameplay, you'll naturally get to know the characters. It's not like it's something like a team-based shooter or anything like that where you're playing and you don't really have much interaction with the cast. Like, it's a visual novel. Most of what you do is interact with the rest of the cast. Granted, with all this out of the way, we're going to get into the retrospective. And here's the thing, unlike with horror, I kind of want to take a different approach for this. Alright. Well, time to talk about something really briefly before we get into the retrospective section. So, unlike with horror games, where horror as a genre was fairly easy to define and fairly well defined outside of games at the time. For example, things like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and if you want to go back really, really far, you have examples like Dracula or the works of Edgar Allan Poe, and I'm pretty sure there's some way farther back that we either don't remember or I have just forgotten to list for research. With logic and deduction games, honestly, it's a little bit harder to pinpoint exactly where the point is that we can trace the origins to. However, I have a pretty good idea, and for that we're going to have to look outside of the realm of video games for a little bit. So, without further ado, let's go back almost 100 years. Who are you even talking to? Time for a statement you never thought you'd hear in a video game retrospective. Our story starts in the year 1947. Anthony Pratt, an Englishman, creates a board game while he is stuck inside during the German air raid. Pratt, a pianist by trade, often saw people he played for engaged in fanciful murder mystery parties, which was very much in vogue with the upper class at the time. Pratt devised a way to turn this into a board game, and boom, Clue was born. Clue centers around a key concept within any form of deduction, the process of elimination. Players are required to guess murder, weapon, and location, and are only given a specific amount of information each turn. Through figuring out what is in other players' hands, you can eventually figure out the murderer. Clue, while not the first, was arguably one of the more pivotal factors in the development of the further logic and deduction genre. While deduction games took a bit to catch on, that does not mean that examples did not exist. Alright, so, I know what you're thinking. SharpZ, this is a video game retrospective, get into the video games. Well, now we will. The earliest example that I could find, and honestly, even if it isn't the earliest, definitely the earliest one worth talking about, is the Famicom Detective Club series. While the original was released on the Famicom Disk System over in Japan, I played a re-release of the second on the Super Nintendo as it has a fan translation online. That's the footage you're going to be seeing for this video. Needless to say, this game is fairly simple, giving the player the feeling that they're actually pressing other people, and, well, writing is engaging. That's kind of the key that you need for simple visual novels like this. The writing's very engaging, and honestly there are a few games later on that we're going to not necessarily cover in the retrospective, but definitely at least touch upon, that I would argue fall under this. The two games also received a remake on Switch, I want to say it was a little over a year ago, and they are well worth it if it's your kind of thing. And it's great to finally have an official way to play these in English. I know that I don't talk about this on my channel too often, but one thing that I absolutely love is when we get games that never really reach the shores of the States finally localized. Hence why I want games like Mother 3, the original Rhythm Heaven, because those are historically prevalent. And, well, I feel this falls in the same boat. It's the same reason why when we covered Sweet Home, the one thing that it made me want was an HD remake of Sweet Home on modern consoles. Just don't base it off the Netflix adaptation. I just really have this thing against Netflix horror content, don't I? Anyway, I feel like we've got good progress from here, so where do we go?
Directly to jail if you don't tell me your alibi.
You see, after the NES, the genre just kind of existed. Clue received a few adaptations on consoles and computers. Grimm Fandango, a charming and innovative point-and-click adventure game by LucasArts, featuring a detective, released. With this release, it seemed that a perfect match was found between the two mediums of gaming and mystery storytelling. And that was the point-and-click. Sure, earlier point-and-click detective games existed, but most of them were designed for a younger audience. Look, I love Freddi Fish and Spy Fox as much as the next guy, but nobody wants to hear me talk about those for an extended period. Actually, people might want that. That might be its own video, who knows. Point-and-click adventures, similar to forensic work, require the player to scrounge around, find important objects, and solve puzzles. Grimm Fandango encapsulated that detective atmosphere perfectly through lighting and the Day of the Dead aesthetic, which was, whoo boy, I love the look of that. Due to the fact it is older and lower poly, that aesthetic really carries the game in the modern day. While Grimm Fandango on its own was revolutionary, it foreshadowed other games to come. Gaming's favorite defense attorney was waiting in the wings, and...
Hold it.
Yeah, that's the line!
Alibi. Now.
Fine, I couldn't have murdered him. I was busy.
Doing what?
Not murdering him. Ace Attorney released on the Game Boy Advance in 2001, and, while successful, I would argue did not truly find its home until released on the DS a few years later. A game with point-and-click elements on this thing? Come on! Like, it has a touchscreen and everything. It's just a match made in heaven. Ace Attorney follows everyone's second favorite, Attorney, as he fumbles like an idiot through multiple cases yet somehow succeeds. Ace Attorney consists of two segments: investigation, point-and-click sections, which involve pressing witnesses in trials, visual novel-like arguments, which involve pressing witnesses with evidence in the later two games. While you can guess, the judge hates your hair and will constantly penalize you every time you try to point at the clearly unhinged criminal witnessing before you. What? As for where to start with the series, The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles is an amazing self-contained adventure, and, well, that's usually where I recommend. It has by far the most welcoming mechanics, allowing you to restart from every single failed position, and honestly, the Sherlock Holmes Victorian era is kind of ripe for mystery genre games. Look, I just really like Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. It's probably the perfect one to pick up. It's on Switch, and I want to say PS4 as well. And considering it's on Switch and PS4, it's probably on PC. I haven't checked, but hey, look, almost everything's on PC nowadays. So, yeah, it's an easy recommendation. Aside from that, the first three games are literally available on, like, everything known to man. The Ace Attorney Trilogy literally just takes the sprites from the GBA version and upreses them to the original drawings. And honestly, regardless of which one you think is better, yeah, I like the look of these drawings. Like, they're well done. Anyway, after Ace Attorney, the games in the logic and deduction genre kind of found their home on handhelds, in particular the DS. A few that immediately come to mind are Hotel Dusk, Touch Detectives, Time Hollow, Professor Layton, and a finally localized PlayStation game, Flower, Sun, and Rain, as well as Another Code. All of these released on the DS. However, there's one game that stood out to me during this time, and it's one that might be a little weird to talk about here. 999. This is an escape room game. and I would argue the best one I've ever played. Now, before everyone goes crazy in the comments, I know, SharpZ, how does this game fit in? Aren't the escape room games more so just puzzle games? Well, to some extent, yes, but here's the thing with escape rooms. Similar to logic and deduction games, structure-wise, you're given quite a few objects or items, and you have to see how they interact and apply with each other to escape the room. Needless to say, the flow of an escape room is very similar to a court case, at least from what I have seen, and I would also argue that, well, at least with the Zero Escape series, it kind of mixes the two. You see, when you go outside of this, your lines of dialogue and your choices throughout the story branches often intertwine and have direct effects on each other. It's complicated. I don't really know how to explain it. But, yeah, I would argue it fits the formula. Now, why this one in particular? Well, number one, 999 is one of the very few M-rated games on the DS, and, well, it's just funny to me that my device that I played on as a kid can have a swear. But, all my joking aside, the graphics and atmosphere are top-notch. And, well, it kind of reminds me of like an old Flash game, and I love that. I always had a notepad nearby when playing these games, and honestly, that's what I view as probably the best way to play a lot of these games. Get a notepad or have your phone out to scroll notes on, and, well, these games immediately become more interesting, and it feels more immersive in a weird way. The endings, I would argue, also somewhat fit this formula, because, well, you have to form various routes to find the true ending, and while Zero Escape 1 does that somewhat, oh my god, look at Zero Escape 2's web chart. What the heck is this thing? The Zero Escape series consists of 3 mainline games, and only 3 games. Yeah, there's no spin-offs to this one, no other trilogy. Granted, the creators of this did go on to make another game, which won't get covered fully here, but will at least be mentioned later. However, the Zero Escape series, I would say 1 and 2 are worth playing. 2 in particular has a fairly emotional story, and the soundtrack in both 1 and 2 are amazing. 3, on the other hand, it drops the ball sometimes. And honestly, graphically, compared to the other 2, it doesn't seem to have as much of a style. You see, I would argue 1 looks the best, which might be weird to say for anyone who doesn't have context with the series, but here's a screenshot from 1, here's a screenshot from 2, and oh dear god, this is 3. Look, I get that they had to GoFundMe for the budget, and honestly, for what they got, they did a pretty good job with it. And I still like the game, the writing's fine, the new characters are a good mix between fun and boring. There's not really anyone here who I absolutely hate. But even then, I would just say play 1 and 2 if you're really interested in it. And if you skip 3 after playing 1 and 2, no harm, no foul. Honestly, it's in between 1 and 2, story-wise, so... Well, kind of, but I don't want to really say anything. Anyway, 999 was made by Spike Chunsoft, and while the DS had its fun with the genre, there was another portable handheld out at the time, the often forgotten PSP. Sony's handheld actually sold fairly well. However, there was a series that was introduced in Japan, something which has kind of been a running theme in this video now that I think about it, that kind of covered the investigation and deduction genre in a new manner. However, it took a while for that game to come to the States, and once Sony's PlayStation Vita hit the market, then we finally got an official States release. What am I talking about? Well, of course I'm talking about Danganronpa, everybody's favorite waifu death game.
If you say that one more time, I will ask for the death penalty.
Wait, for me or for yourself? Danganronpa, oh boy, how do I describe this one? So, imagine the gameplay flow of Ace Attorney in the Trials, alongside the point-and-click adventure segments with investigation beforehand, but alongside that, you also have a dating sim segment between all of the other stuff going on, and the trials are partially an on-rail shooter because you have people's dialogue flying back and forth, and you have to shoot it with your truth bullets. I love this game. It's just so... It is such a weird concept, and it just works. And, well, one thing Danganronpa does that I would argue is outside of maybe 999 or to an extent some characters in Ace Attorney, it really makes you bond with the characters. Whether you love them, hate them, or whatever Nagito is supposed to make me feel. I mean, I don't know. Oh, how am I supposed to feel about this guy? It's kind of sad to see them go. As for gameplay, shooting through people's arguments, and the general look of the games, oh boy, this game is... You know, I know that somebody's gonna call me a Tumblr fan for saying this, but I like it. The aesthetic kind of is very bright and cheery for everything that's going on. The pink blood, while somewhat there for censorship and to keep the tone fairly light, honestly gives this game a unique style that when I look at pink blood, I think, yeah, Danganronpa. And the music, I love the music. You've been hearing it in the background here, and oh boy, at least for the mainline series, ooh boy. Like, honestly, if we ever got a character in Smash from one of these games, I would want it to be Monokuma. Just because we could get the music. Yeah, that's right, I want Monokuma over Phoenix Wright. Is there an issue with that? Now, granted, Danganronpa, at least the mainline series, got 3 entries, and I can easily recommend any of them. So go ahead, try them out. This video will still be here. And as for what they're available on, well, honestly, I would say any version's okay except for maybe V3 on Switch. When I tried V3, I noticed a few issues here and there. I don't know if they've been patched out because I did play it a few months ago, so they might have been patched out by the time I'm making this video, but I don't know. Anyways, Danganronpa 1, 2, and V3 I think are available on PC, PlayStation, pretty much everything except the Xbox. I know they're available on iOS and Android, I want to say, as well. So, you know, pick them up and have some fun. Honestly, them being available on Switch is kind of... It makes sense. One thing I always say about the Switch that no one ever takes me seriously on, it's kind of become the place of new life for dead Vita franchises. And I'm going to let that stick here.
Alright. You've had your fun, now give me your alibi.
Fine. I was just sitting in my room, searching for copies of Clue.
Yeah. Actually, that matches the subpoena that I called on you. Oh, what the... Oh, come on, that can't be real. Downton Abbey... Seinfeld... Family Guy... Simpsons... Golden Girls, what in the world? These are all... You sick. Sick, man.
Yeah, I don't know why half of these exist either. It's not my fault they made a Golden Girls Clue game, and you can't tell me that you are not at least intrigued by that. Alright, after this point, the genre really diversified, and it's really not too profitable to try to timeline it all out. So, instead of taking that route, I'm going to do something a little more simple, and we're going to move on to social deduction. Whereas the general deduction genre kind of has a fairly easy to track origin, when it comes to the more, I guess, social side of things, it's a little bit harder to pinpoint. You see, some of the earliest examples I could find through my research were actually mods. Things like Trouble in Terrorist Town immediately come to mind. And one that I really want to point out, just because I actually got the time to delve into the game and the community for it is absolutely lovely, is Space Station 14. This game is, to put it very simply not a pure social deduction game, but one of the enemies in it does very much play to that kind of, I guess, design philosophy. So I played it for research for this game, and it's a fan-supported kind of open and free community, and well, I just want to give them a shout out here because at least from the few rounds I played, I really liked it and highly would recommend it. But when it comes to some of the bigger ones that I think people want me to talk about, I'm just going to go ahead and get into those. Some of the earliest ones I could find where you can say, yeah, it's purely social deduction would be games like Town of Salem, where it's more so text-based and fairly simple. Of course, the genre has quite a few examples, but Town of Salem's probably the first one that actually hit it fairly big. After that, we know the one that comes next. I'm not going to say it because, well, it's a meme now, and I don't want to put them in the thumbnail. These things are going to haunt me for the rest of my life. Anyway, with all that out of the way, through playing all of these social deduction games, I found that two kind of rose to the top for me. And those two were... With all that being said, social deduction, to me, really needs to have a little bit more to it to draw me in. However, there are two games that I feel like kind of hit the mark for me. Project Winter and Crime Site. Project Winter is a survival game mixed with social deduction. The concept, while sounding clunky, works very well, actually. Mainly because with how survival games work, especially the ones that really focus on survival, we're not talking something like Minecraft, more so something like Project Zombie. Or is it Zomboid? I forget which one of the two it is, and at this point I'm too afraid to ask. Anyway, if you do not work together, there is a high chance you won't survive, and when you can't trust one member of your party but you don't know who it is, it leads to some interesting moments. That and the fairly, I would say, flexible mechanics of the game lead to numerous strategies being used for victory, which, honestly, I have a lot of respect for. I myself have even found ways to game the system. Some of the more interesting ones I've seen is people wasting resources and trying to make it look like it was someone else to frame one of the other party members, coercing enemies into fights. So, for example, there's been times when wild animals have come to attack and they've been the one who provoked it. Mainly because, well, if there's more enemies and someone gets killed, that makes their job a little bit less strenuous. Or even mess with explosives to make death seem like an accident. Furthermore, on the side of players, the nature of the game promotes distrust in an environment where the only option is to work together. So, yeah, unlike something like Among Us, where you can kind of go off and do your own thing, in Project Winter, going off on your own is kind of a risky proposition. Especially when you hit that final stretch and things begin to get a little more complex. Here's the thing, though. You're also kind of incentivized in a weird way to make sure that while people do stay alive, you also have a good handle on all your resources. Because usually as the game goes on and food gets more sparse, you'll also have less members to worry about. Especially if you manage to get rid of your threats. The next one is Crime Site, the only good thing Konami has done in the past few years. Okay, fine, they re-released Castlevania, and Silent Hill is coming back, but I'm still reluctant and on the fence about it, and I refuse to admit that I will act like I am happy until Silent Hill 1 and Silent Hill 2, 3, and 4, the original games, are readily available. Actually, 4 is available on GOG, but still. Anyway, all my anger and sadness at Konami aside, Crime Site is a mix of Clue and chess. At least that's the best way I can describe it. 2 to 4 players play as either a team of murderers or detectives working under Sherlock or Moriarty. I'm going to butcher that name. Give me 1 second. Moriarty? Hey, Trent, you're a detective. You pronounce this. Thank you. The average match is a decent amount of time, and honestly, the interesting thing is with how the mechanics work. So, basically put, both players on either side have a control of a variety of characters on the board. However, there's one innocent character and one dedicated murderer. But the people who are innocent don't know who the innocent character is, and they don't know who the murderer is. There are a few requirements that you have to actually fulfill to complete the murder, and that's that no one can be there to witness it. So, yeah, it kind of feels almost like a game of chess in that you're moving characters around, and especially since you can move there are pieces that are shared between you and your opponent. I have seen people use bluffs, and I have also seen people, just move characters around to mess with each other. That and gaslighting is a valid strategy because, if you just slightly move characters, or kind of move characters in a way that looks like you moved someone else, then that kind of makes your opponent a little on edge and a little uneasy about what's going on. Alright, with all of my shilling and looking at games out of the way, what makes a good deduction game? Well, here's the thing. With deduction games, unlike horror, I feel like there's a lot more broadness in what can really fit in the genre. Not in the gameplay sense, but more so in what makes a good one. And for this, I'm just going to do a brief comparison of two games in the genre which I love, but for completely different reasons. Alright, I know I briefly defined what a deduction or logical statement was earlier, but I'm going to elaborate now. So, the best way I can do this is by using letters, and trust me, it's not going to be as complicated as it sounds. So, statement A plus statement B equals statement C is the usual formula you see. And usually good deduction games will use statement C to draw a further conclusion. The reason I said linear deduction is even if the deductions themselves are not directly linked, usually you follow one conclusion to the other. Whereas with non-linear deduction games, you might find a piece of the puzzle for the mystery on the other side of the deduction line. Now, for the comparison, the two games that I've decided to cover are Obra Dinn and Ace Attorney. And the reason I decided on these two is, Obra Dinn I did a massive video essay on, and I feel like, honestly, out of all the games that I have taken the time to look over for this retrospective, it's the one that I kind of feel embodies the most what I think makes a good deduction game, so I want to talk about it. And Ace Attorney because, it's a good example of what happens when you go the opposite direction and how you can still make it work. In particular, when I say Ace Attorney, I'm going to be talking about Great Ace Attorney here. Even if there is kind of more so footage from across the series, Great Ace Attorney is the one I'm mostly going to be referencing just because it's the most recent one, and it's kind of the easiest one for me to go back to personally. Anyway, with Obra Dinn, the strength of that game is that it almost entirely is on the player's agency. Rather than giving the players something like a case file where evidence is stored or some kind of journal where they can just draft stuff down, it's up to the player to solve everyone's fate. Think of it like how I described Clue earlier. Usually you have a specific set of information that you can get on each turn. For those unaware of how Clue works, I'm just going to give a brief explanation so this analogy makes sense. With Clue, and, pretty much all versions of it, every player will have a deck in their hand of various characters, places, or weapons. And when another player makes a prediction, the other players can decide to show a specific card to contradict what their prediction is. So, for example, if I had the card for Colonel Mustard and someone said, I think Colonel Mustard killed one of the other people with a... Look, I don't remember anyone else's name. Colonel Mustard's just the best character in Clue. Fight me. Anyway, Colonel Mustard murdered Jerry in the atrium with an ice pick. Then, well, if I had the card for Colonel Mustard, I could put it down and say, my sweet boy is innocent. Why am I saying this for talking about Obra Dinn and Ace Attorney? Because, well, it works in the exact same way. You see, with logic and deduction games, what controls the flow and what controls the pacing is information. So, it's kind of vital that you keep information pertinent unless it's an intentional red herring. I'm not saying that it can't be done well. There have been times where games have sent me on a wild goose chase going up the wrong tree, and I kind of appreciated it in a weird way because it makes you appreciate the core mystery more, that the red herring still makes sense. But as a general rule of thumb, you want good pacing and good focus. And Obra Dinn and Ace Attorney encounter this in separate ways. You see, Obra Dinn's flow is very disjointed. You have some scenes that are very pertinent and happen at the beginning that you do not see until the end, and plot-important elements aren't introduced until about halfway through the flashbacks at the very least. Like, dear Lord, if you have not played the game before, you probably won't know what's going on until, I would say, about 3 to 4 hours in. Now, with Ace Attorney, obviously, the flow is fairly linear. It's a court case, after all. You gather evidence, you go to court, and you present your case. As such, while the logical lines in something like Obra Dinn usually go in a formula of, oh, I can eliminate this person, and it's more so like Clue's checklist formula, if you were to look at something like Ace Attorney, it kind of goes by a different metric. You see, usually the logical statements, as I mentioned earlier, which is Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal, is, well, kind of a basic basic outline for how Ace Attorney will run. So, I'm not going to give an example from a case, but use what I just said to further my point. Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, all mortals can die, therefore Socrates can die. See, what this is just a basic extension of the statement. See, how these statements work are, and I'm going to say this as someone who's more familiar with coding, more so if-then statements than mathematical equations. What do I mean by this? Well, for example, let's pretend we have two suspects, and since I want to keep with the theme of the video, and we're talking about Ace Attorney right now, Miles and Phoenix. So, let's just say that, Maya Fey was murdered in the kitchen. Phoenix Wright has lost the key to the kitchen. Phoenix Wright was in the bathroom around the time of the murder. The bathroom is on the opposite side of the courthouse from the kitchen. Therefore, Phoenix Wright could not be the murderer. Granted, sometimes these logical statements are actually used in a contradictory way. For example, with the flow of something like Ace Attorney, there are often 3 or 4 words that you can apply to it. Number 1 is a however or a but, which is pretty much saying that logical statement might be true, however, it doesn't hold enough precedent to be used as evidence. For example, the bathroom is on the opposite side of the courthouse, but Maya was killed by poisonous gas, and the vent system goes between that bathroom and the kitchen. Look, I'm not an architect, this probably makes no sense, but just roll with it. Another way that you can go from these statements is logically going to the next through line. For example, if Phoenix Wright is not the murderer, and well, Miles Edgeworth is the only other person in the building at the time of the murder, then Miles Edgeworth is the murderer. However, that usually isn't the case, because usually what these games will do is introduce twists and hooks to kind of keep you strung along, but usually there's at least hints to these. Why am I talking about all this when talking about logic and deduction games? Well, I think the key element to any deduction or logic game is one word: pacing. Yeah, I don't think it's really too complicated. If your game has pretty good pacing and pretty interesting mechanics, then you'll probably be fine. If your logical statements kind of seem to flow and, well, when players are playing, they kind of have this feeling of, oh, I figured it out, rather than, well, that's stupid, then yeah, I think you're doing a good job, which leads to kind of the more, I guess, player-related aspects of this genre. And for this, I'm just going to go back to Facecam, because I'm going to be honest, 8 minutes of putting editing stuff over a clip of me talking is not the most fun for me, editing-wise, and I should probably stop talking. You know, it would be very embarrassing if I just kept this in and kind of like cut out in the middle just for the sake of fun. Yeah, the core to this genre working well, I would say, is how you decide to involve the player, because, well, here's the thing, at the end of the day, they're the ones solving the mystery. For example, that's why I chose 999. You see, when it comes to escape rooms, logic is kind of key. It's up to the player to find what series of events or series of puzzles they need to complete to escape the room. And, well, the overarching story follows that too. Good mix of trial and error, yada yada. Look, I just really wanted to talk about this game, and I'm going to be honest, puzzle games are something where I actually have interesting opinions on those, so that's going to get probably its own 2-part video or something down the line. But, all of that aside, the reason why I am talking in depth about player interaction in this segment is because, well, the best mystery games let players feel like they are the ones solving the mystery. You see, if there's a deduction that is done off-screen, or someone figures something out that the player couldn't, then, well, it kind of makes the player feel patronized or talked down to more so than smart. And granted, you can use different elements to show this. For example, in a lot of court case games, you might not have an idea of who the killer is going into the court case, but once you start talking to them and interrogating them, then you begin to realize, oh yeah, this person's probably the killer. Danganronpa is perfect as an example for this. Usually going into the courtroom, you might have 1 or 2 suspects in mind, but sometimes throughout the court case is when you really begin to determine, hey, it's probably this person. Some of them are more obvious than others, but most of the time I would say, yeah, they're pretty interesting and good court cases. But, with that being said, the core difference between these two is how the player interacts with the mystery. You see, in something like Ace Attorney, as I mentioned before, it's a fairly linear mystery. It feels like you're going straight forward through it. For example, when you're playing Ace Attorney, you kind of just start by gathering your evidence, going into the courtroom, and the pacing is very much determined by who's witnessing, who you're cross-examining, or what contradictions you can find in people's statements. Compare this to Obra Dinn, where it's entirely upon the player to figure out what happened to each character, and then even after that, you're not told the full series of events, you kind of need to deduce that yourself. I'm being serious, I completed that game 2 or 3 times, and I still had to reference the wiki page a whole lot to even get the summary out for that game. I still love it though. Like, go play it. It's absolutely amazing. But it's just kind of a thing that's emblematic of the games that leave it more up to players. You see, when you do that, there's more of a risk to it because, well, sometimes players don't know where to look. And granted, it's kind of a question between, do you think your game would fit better if it's more so a free-form, free-roaming environment, or if it's more so controlled? Because here's the thing, similar to what you would see between something like a 2D and 3D platformer, linear and non-linear deduction games have kind of the same strengths and weaknesses. You see, with a 2D platformer or a linear deduction game, you can make things tight, controlled, responsive, and you can make it more challenging by that degree. For example, some of the hardest deductions I've had to make in games like the Zero Escape series, the series that 999 is a part of, have involved me having to think about all the information I've seen, take multiple notes, cross-reference notes, look at astrology charts, and all this crazy stuff. And if the game didn't have somewhat of a linear guideline to follow, I would probably be completely lost. But there are other deduction games, like Obra Dinn, where you're more so making smaller deductions that all lead into one massive web. I mean, I don't need to find out what happened to every single character in the story. I don't need to find out where the Kraken came from. I don't need to find out where the mermaids came from. All I need to figure out is, how did all these people die? Because that's your character's job. So, it doesn't feel as unapproachable. And honestly, that's my only issue when it comes to non-linear games, is sometimes they fail to consider this. For the games I mentioned earlier, well, let me go ahead and mention the one that immediately comes to mind for this, and that would be... Alright, I say this out of a place of love. Paradise Killer is a game that I absolutely love, but I just felt this was the perfect example to point to of how necessary it is to make sure the player's actually interacting with the information you give them. And if the people who made the game watch it, look, I love your game. Do not get me wrong. Honestly, from start to finish, the characters had me intrigued. The overall world had me intrigued. I absolutely love the idea of adding a movement system into a very, very basic mystery game. And even though navigation in this game isn't the most fun, it definitely is more entertaining than it has any right to be. That and the accessibility options, I am very, very happy to say you guys nailed it from at least what I saw. The only things I would kind of argue for are more so the things that we see here. So, let's talk about the case file system that they have in this game. You see, on one hand, I kind of like it because it has a direct file for leads, so if you find information, you can follow a lead and try to find out if anything else regarding that lead will come to any form of a conclusion. And, well, it kind of makes you feel disconnected from the information. You see, unlike something like Danganronpa or Ace Attorney, even though this game has small segments of puzzle solving, there's not really any points where I felt like, hey, I found this evidence, I'm directly interacting with the crime scene, or, well, the mystery being relegated to a part of the menu where I honestly only spent time to try to formulate ideas on what could be a new lead, made me feel a little overwhelmed at times. And I feel like it kind of speaks to what I feel is necessary to make these games, well, more approachable. I know that I praise it a lot, but Obra Dinn's solution of having a book where you just can log what you think happened to various people, and then after you get 3 correct, it confirms them, is simple, yes, but here's the thing. It forces players to constantly interact with the information, and, well, I feel that's the best way to do it. That's something that I feel Paradise Killer did not do the best, because here's the thing, I just ended up doing kind of what I did in Danganronpa when it came to interactions with the characters, just trying to max out my actual social links with them, while also doing everything possible to get any form of information, or, well, just anything as leads on these files, number one. Number two, my issue with the concept of leads in this game is just sometimes they feel like they don't lead to enough information, and especially since I had to continually go back and forth from the menu, even though I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. Heck, I feel like it's probably one of the things in mystery games that I enjoy the most is opening like your clipboard or your mystery file and trying to rearrange and organize everything, and that's my key issue here. What I honestly wish that you could do with the pieces of evidence you grab is somehow take them and arrange it into... So with how the information is shown here, there are these 3 grids, and I'm just going to go ahead and explain how I think you could easily fix this. If you could just align these up, and every character maybe had 1 or 2 that fit together, and you could just select it and say, all this goes to this case file, or you had the option to, I guess, more succinctly interact with this information, then it would feel much more cohesive to me. My main issue is it just felt like I wasn't doing a lot of the work myself, and I was just kind of running around trying to get any information possible. But in the end, I don't really have too much I want to say about this game more than that. It's a really good game. Go play it. I'm just kind of saying... I want to reiterate once again, I don't hate this game. I absolutely love this game, but I feel like, I can't really ignore the fact that it does provide an example of what can happen if you do not force the player to interact with the information in a meaningful way. Because here's the thing, I found that there were examples where it actually did this fairly well, where a character would give you a lead, and then I would find myself kind of like scrounging around for any information I could, time and time again. And that was probably the most interesting parts of the game. Now, with linear games, you can actually go into the opposite issue. Alright, so I'm actually recording this segment after everything else. I had previously recorded it, and I did not realize that there was a small issue with that recorded segment, and that was that I forgot to mention a few things. So, let's go through the recommendations, just since this is how I usually do the format, and how I want to continue to do the format. So, first off, 999. This one's kind of obvious. Don't really feel like I need to explain this one. Out of every single game I've covered for this video, if there's any game that I would recommend you try to find a way to play, it's this one. Whether it be via the original DS or the re-releases that are on PS4 and Steam, and I want to say Xbox. Honestly, I wish this one would come to the Switch, as part of why I hope the Danganronpa releases really sold well enough. Because this series is... It is, in my opinion, the equivalent of... I guess it's kind of like the Star Wars of escape games. Minus the popularity, more so in that it's just like, this is the quintessential escape game series, if you were to ask me. Because it intertwines that entire philosophy into not just the games into not just the rooms themselves, but also the overarching narrative. Because very much at times it feels like you're trying to escape the narrative and find... there's an element of puzzle solving to the narrative itself. Hence why I felt it would be perfect to put into here. There's concepts introduced in there that are very... I forget the term. I want to say it's metaphysics. I want to say that's the technical term for it. Look, I'm not a scientist. I wouldn't know. This one's not a recommendation. It's just I'm putting this up here because I own it and I just think it's funny. Mystery Case Files Millionaire. This falls into that shovelware category that you see with almost every genre. It's very much just a point and click. I just wanted to show it because it says on the back that it does not include a Nintendo DS. I am not joking. It says on the back of the box, Nintendo DS not included. So, I don't know. I just thought that was funny. Anyway, let's get back into the more so legitimate recommendations. Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law. I absolutely love this game, and I love the TV show it's based on. It was a show that aired on Adult Swim. I want to say it was the early 2000s. But this game, needless to say, is absolutely... It's a perfect adaptation of the show, and that Harvey Birdman is an absolute idiot, as he always should be. Full motion video, and since it was made by Capcom, it has a little bit of that Ace Attorney feel, but also it uses Capcom characters, like on the back of the box here, it actually shows Guile, for example. And it just... This game is so dumb it works, okay? That's the best way I can describe the entirety of the show and the game. They are so dumb of a concept that they just work. Alright, now let's go to one that isn't for me, and some people are probably wondering why I did not cover it in this video. LA Noire. I'm not a big fan of a lot of Rockstar's games. Outside of, I want to say, San Andreas and the original Red Dead, I haven't really gotten too big into any of their things. And I played enough of this to say it is a good game. It was very limited by the technology of its time. For those who are unaware, the main gameplay loop of LA Noire involves using tells, which was actually done in a later Ace Attorney game as well to a much better effect, mainly because Ace Attorney doesn't rely on a realistic look. Anyway, LA Noire is a fairly decent experience. It's just not the kind of thing I'm into, but if you're looking for more so a realistic, gritty detective game that takes place in the that area, sure, this might be a good one for you. Now I'm going to move on to the two. I have 2 on PS4 and 2 on Switch, and then we're going to move on to the ones that I don't own physically, but I still want to talk about. So, Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth. I got this one for like $2, and mainly because I am a big fan of this guy's novels. I know what you're saying, SharpZ, you nerd. I know. I just really like historical fiction occasionally, and his work is very well researched. This one, if I remember correctly, it lets you change how the novel works. Yeah, fight for a beacon of peace in a world full of hate. It's a very... It very thinly falls into this category, but I wanted an opportunity to talk about it. And The Observer, I know I talked about it for horror games, but the main thing is it's all about investigating your surroundings. There's not that much logical deduction that actually goes on in this one, but I just wanted to at least mention it. Let's see here. That's all the physical ones I have for PS4. Now let's move on to Switch. Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. Just view this as more emblematic of the series as a whole. I think this is the perfect starting point for people. If you don't know if you're going to like Ace Attorney or not, this one's very self-contained. It has a lot of accessibility options and just kind of nice things to have in it. If I remember correctly, it lets you restart after every failed period of the court case rather than restart the whole court case if you fail. So if you're like me and you have this tendency to say, I really don't like to save scum on these kind of games, then this one might be perfect for you. Also, music's amazing in this one. It's pretty much orchestrated renditions of a lot of the classics mixed with some new things here and there. The cast is really fun, which is kind of something you can say for most Ace Attorney games. Not necessarily like the deepest cast or the one you'll have the most investment in, but it's definitely a fun romp that took me a good amount of time to finish. If I'm being honest, I think this took me more time to beat the 2 games included in Great Ace Attorney than the 3 games included in Ace Attorney Trilogy, which that's also an easy recommendation. It's the first 3 games re-released on modern consoles with the sprite art redone as hand drawings, or I think they just took the original hand drawings and put them in there. Now, let's move on to the other one, Danganronpa. Another easy recommendation here. This series is... Look, it's absolutely edgy and stupid, but it's the funny kind of edgy and stupid. Like, this game knows what it is and it doesn't try to be anything else, number 1. Number 2, it's a good example of throwing in together a whole lot of stuff that you don't think will work well together, and yet it does. Mainly, I would say the dating sim aspect of it. I say dating sim, but it's not a full-on dating sim, but they take aspects of one in the day-to-day life segments, and that makes it so that when a character dies, you really feel it. Or when a character's a murderer, you're like, darn it. That means that we have to vote them out. But, all of that aside, with Danganronpa, it's just it is a fun series to get into. I love 1 and 2 to death. V3 is not my favorite, but I still think there's some fun parts of it. And with all 3 of them, I'll say the cast are absolutely a blast. There's a few cast members in each game you'll hate, but usually they find a good balance between killing off the ones you dislike and keeping ones that aren't the most interesting but kind of have to be there for plot reasons. So they have a good mix of characters in each. Honestly, easy recommendation, yet again. Now let's go to the ones that I don't own physically, but I still want to talk about. So, for this I actually have another document list. Yay! We're doing the same thing we did with the horror games, where I have these all listed on a document that I forgot to open. And since I usually would cut this out, we're just going to act like I am doing this professionally and not pulling up a document. So if anyone watches this video, just please comment that SharpZ is completely professional and never makes any editing mistakes. That would be great. Anyway, on the document here, I have a few listed. So, there was actually one board game I wanted to mention. Murder in Hong Kong. Or I forget whether it's Deduction, Murder in Hong Kong, or just Murder in Hong Kong. It is a board game that takes the concept of Clue, but one of the players is the murderer, and I don't want to say any more than that, because if you're not sold by that point, I don't think you're going to get too much into it. Of course, there's games like Secret Hitler, which are fairly common. I played 1 or 2 rounds just to get a good idea of how those games would work. There's a few in Jackbox that follow that formula as well, but I didn't really have the time to look into all of them. Alright, so for video games that we have talked about, I would say for 999 or just the entire Zero Escape series, go for it. Famicom Detective Club. Now, there are 3 releases of these games that are out and about. The original one is only in Japanese, unless there are fan translations, which to my knowledge there are not. And it's on the Famicom Disk System, which is an interesting part of Nintendo's history, but really I would say it's not the best version to go seeking out. It's fairly expensive, you would have to import it, and you would have to own a disk system. The SNES version never got a release in the States and is only in Japanese, so honestly, if you're going to find any way to play these, I would say go with the new Switch releases if you can find them on sale. I don't know if the price point's really worth it, because I actually dipped my toes in the series with the SNES release and really fell in love with that one, and I kind of am a sucker for that old pixel art style. Like, I love PC 98 mystery games, which there are a few that we could have covered, but I decided to hold off on those because I want to give the PC 98 its own video. Disco Elysium. This one was a Game of the Year nominee a few years back, and if I remember correctly, it has a lot of these elements, and I started playing it recently, and honestly, if it keeps going the way it is, yeah, this one's an easy recommendation. Return of the Obra Dinn. Talked about it briefly. Another easy recommendation. Alright, Tokyo Dark is one I do not have on here, but I do want to just briefly mention. It falls more into the horror category, but does have a few investigation elements, where it's more so what are the consequences of your actions that you're trying to decipher. Which, speaking of what are the consequences of your actions, the Sexy Brutale, Elsinore, and the Forgotten City. Those 3 are all clockwork investigation games, which sounds weird, but trust me, they're all 3 really fun. Elsinore is based off Hamlet, and I'm a Shakespeare nut, so of course I love it. The Sexy Brutale has this very nice art style, and out of the 3, I would say is the best. And let me see here, the final one has by far the best atmosphere. The Forgotten City is just amazing. Gnosia. That one combines roguelike elements with an investigation game. It's kind of like a visual novel where whoever's the murderer is random, and it kind of falls more into social deduction. My only issue with it is since it is a visual novel, there's not really too much gameplay interaction. And while usually with these that wouldn't be too much of an issue, at least on my end it kind of felt draining due to the fact that it's a roguelike. How roguelikes are usually designed is you play them over and over again. And at least with this, since it's reading text walls over and over and over again, it got fairly repetitive. But I would say if you can find it on a good sale and maybe play through it 2 or 3 times, you'll have fun with it. Alright, let me see what else we have here. Obviously, Crime Site and Project Winter are easy recommendations. If you want one that is very quick bursts of deduction, games like Papers, Please are perfect for this. And I know that's a weird one to bring up here, but I don't know where else I'll bring it up, because Papers, Please is... It fairly simply follows this. Granted, it's heavily based on your moral choices, but you still have that aspect of deducing whether someone is safe to let into the nation or not. Alright, now I'm going to go into the indie ones that I just really like and want to talk about. Tangle Tower. Oh boy, look at this. Like, I love old point-and-click adventure games. It's something that you might or might not have been able to tell by this video because I briefly mentioned them. Like, the old Freddi Fish game is honestly... I'm just going to throw that in, yeah. Play some of those old edutainment games like Freddi Fish, Pajama Sam, Putt-Putt. Those were fairly fun to my recollection. And I went back and actually played Freddi Fish again recently, and that one's also held up fairly well. Anyway, that's beyond the point. Oh boy. If you look at that game, if you look at just how it plays with Tangle Tower, number one, it does something. It's absolutely beautiful art style-wise. Number two, the voice acting in it is something that more of these games should really do. Here's the thing. I know voice acting is not something that's like the cheapest on the budget, but for these kind of games, if you have a lot of text walls, at least invest in doing like flavor sounds or something like that, because like Danganronpa's voice trials are probably some of the best in the industry. And speaking of voice acting, we have one more that could fall into this that isn't necessarily indie, but I do need to talk about, because I mentioned that there was a follow-up that the team of 999 did, and that is AI the Somnium Files and its sequel, AI the Somnium Files Nirvana Initiative. Both of those are really good. They're fairly long experiences. Not really the most deduction involved, but they're definitely some of the more fun ones that I remember playing throughout the course of research for this. Last Express. This one falls into that too. It's just kind of an old point and click and fairly fun. If I remember correctly here, there's only maybe one or two more I want to talk about. Oh yeah, how could I forget this one? One of my favorite ones I played throughout the course of this video is one of the simplest ones conceptually, Will a Wonderful World. That game really needs to get more attention, I swear. I haven't seen much attention for it, and I'm surprised as to why. Very simple concept. You switch around sentences within a story, and it changes the results. But, it's a good one. It's just a good one. Murder by Numbers is literally Picross mixed with a murder mystery, and I love Picross. It's a fun thing to do occasionally, so that's getting thrown in there as well. Perfect Heist 1 and 2. These are social deduction games I actually didn't mention. These mix bank robbery with social deduction. That's the best way I can describe it. I think, yeah, there is one more. Root Letter. If you want to try the Famicom Detective Club games but don't want to pay that price point, Root Letter is honestly your best shot. I've gotten it for around $1 to $3 for the Switch version because the Switch version is the upgraded version. It is a fairly fun visual novel. Fairly slow-paced, but honestly, it really encapsulates that feel of the Famicom Detective Club games, which I think was the goal of it. Mainly just that feeling of slowly putting together information. The Detective Club games, compared to a lot of the other ones on this list, have a very slow and methodical pace. It's not like with Danganronpa or Ace Attorney where there's a court trial pushing things forward. It's just, let's try to get to the bottom of this mystery. But I think with that about covers everything. Which reminds me, Trent, do you have anything you want to... Where did he go?
The name is Brockman. Trent Brockman. I was hired presuming this would be a murder case. However, when I came in, I found a note telling me to grab the specific notebook for information. In the notebook, I found one thing. A series of words. I don't know what these could mean. What in the world have I gotten this kid into?
Hey guys, it's SharpZ. Thank you for watching this video. It took not as long as the horror one to make, but definitely still a long time. For the cryptic messaging at the end here, just kind of giving a slight hint, only one of those video ideas that was shown in the last few minutes is 100% guaranteed to happen. The other two are complete red herrings. Since I felt that, you know, it was genre of logic and deduction, we should probably end the video with something of that nature. So I'm gonna leave it up to you people to try to guess which one it is. I'm planning on doing all of them at some point. It's just for right now, there's only one I know for sure I want to do. Anyway, all of that aside, wow, it has been a crazy year, and I mean, I don't know if there's going to be another video coming out this year, probably not, but I just want to say thank you to everyone who has been watching this year. It was kind of crazy coming back to making YouTube fairly consistently after leaving for a good while. I really just had lost my motivation for content, and now I feel it's back. And, well, I just, you know, I want to say thank you for this year. It's been a hard year for me, obviously. There's been a lot that's happened, some good, some bad. And it's kind of crazy to me, because a little bit of a offshoot tangent. This video was originally written a year ago. Back when the To the Moon review came out, this video was supposed to be what came out instead. But I realized, hey, I want to do something different. You know, I want to make a video on a game I love, and I realized after that, hey, that's what I like to do. I don't like to try to force myself to cover things I don't want to. And with Genre in a Bottle, it has become something that I'm making out of my love for the history of this medium. With logic and deduction games, there are a lot that I didn't even touch on, and it's a niche genre. It's not even a very broad one. So it's kind of crazy to me that I can make these videos and people actually watch them. All that aside, just a few housekeeping things. Next month in January, we do have some big video projects coming up, so it's probably going to be a slight delay between videos. Dev streams have been happening for a while. At first there were a few that have numbers on them, now they do not. Mainly just developer stuff I felt would be better if I kind of left it open to you can hop in, hop out when you want to. It's more so me streaming because I know some people like watching the creative process of people developing. So it's more so for fun. As for just everything else, thank you guys. It's been a crazy year. If this is your first time watching one of my videos, hi, I'm SharpZ. I'm the only guy who works on this channel. I make games, I play games, I love video games, and I just want to kind of share what I enjoy about the medium with other people. So if you want to like and subscribe, I know it's kind of a cliche, but hey, this video is probably going to go up on Christmas Day, so Christmas gift to me, maybe. It's free, it's easy to do, and, well, I feel like it's been a long journey for me. I've had this channel for over 5 years, and never really got to the point where I am now, where I thought, I want to make this long-form content. I always had drafted up but never made it. And there's some videos I want to make that I'm not going to plan, and just kind of let them happen. But at least for right now, there's a few I have planned out that I want to do. And let's just say, if you're looking forward to January, it's going to be a massive 3-part project. So, I should probably leave and get to work on that. Until next time, guys, this is SharpZ, signing off.